Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, September 25th, 2023. And today I'm going to highlight some of the most common and the biggest myths about nullification. I'm sure some people just repeat them out of total ignorance, but there are certainly others who do it on purpose. They're lying. And so today I'm going to just get right into the top four. These change every time I think about this. And I know I've done episodes covering this probably in a few years. I haven't done that, but let's go through these. The first one is basically something like this. Nullification was invented out of thin air by John C. Calhoun or Thomas Jefferson, usually one or the other, and has no foundation in anything. In other words, they're basically saying it's a made-up doctrine. It has no support from the founding generation, from the American Revolution, from anything else, and it should be rejected outright. But here's how James Madison put it in 1834. He said, "The right of nullification meant by Mr. Jefferson is the natural right, which all admit to be a remedy against insupportable oppression." Here's the father of the Constitution discussing opposition to nullification at that time, but also pointing out that even though he was opposed to a specific process that was being proposed by South Carolina at the time, he was also acknowledging that what Jefferson was talking about in 1798, of course, which I will discuss a little bit more in this episode, was absolutely legitimate. It was not only a natural right, but everyone at the time of the founding admitted that it was a remedy against insupportable oppression. I've even got Alexander Hamilton on our side on that one, even though he doesn't use the word nullification. And it should be pointed out, though, that natural rights are not created out of thin air by any person. They are not originated by anyone. So because it's a natural right, John C. Calhoun didn't create it. Jefferson didn't create it. It's created by the nature of our humanity, the laws of nature. And Madison was just reiterating what Jefferson had to say in his draft of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 against the Hated Alien and Sedition Acts. He said every state, and in this context, it's the people of each state. It's not the state governments, although the people can tell the state government what to do. And if the government does the right thing, then of course they're going to nullify all kinds of unconstitutional acts. But Jefferson said every state has a natural right, in cases not within the compact, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. There's a lot in that statement, but we're focusing on the fact that Jefferson also called this a natural right of the people in each state to nullify of their own authority. Basically, they don't need approval of their neighbors. They don't need their neighboring states. They don't need a bunch of states. They don't need any other state. They don't need the federal government to approve. No one needs to approve it whatsoever, because this is a natural right to resist people who encroach on powers that are supposed to be reserved to the people of that state. And Jefferson, of course, wasn't just reiterating something that he had made up because this is a natural right. He was reiterating essential principles of the American Revolution, and the American Revolution being that radical change in the viewpoints of the people from around 1760 through 1775, before the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord, that gun control program. But here's Jefferson again from that fair copy in October of 1798-ish. He said, "Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force." So one of the main principles of the revolution was that soon as government goes beyond its limits, and of course, for the founders, for the old revolutionaries, this was an unwritten constitution, and that's part of why they put it on paper, was so it was very clear when government was going beyond its limits. And as soon as it goes beyond its limits, those acts are void. So if something is void, you don't sit and comply with it. It's trash. It should be ignored, resisted, rejected, nullified into oblivion where it belongs. And that's where Jefferson took this later in that same document. So anytime government goes beyond its limits, its acts are void, whether the government admits it or not. And government generally does not. He said the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. And this was, again, if we're talking about reiterating the principles of the Revolution, Jefferson certainly was aware of what went down. We can go all the way back to February of 1761, what John Adams called the start of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain, James Otis Jr.'s great argument against the writs of assistance, where he said an act against the Constitution is void. It's the same kind of message that Jefferson had those decades later. Soon as they go beyond the limits, it's void. The question is, how do you treat it? And Patrick Henry gave us some in 1765. In his resolutions against the Stamp Act in May of 1765, he had just turned 29, maybe 10 or 11 days earlier. He put together some resolutions against the Stamp Act and said, well, basically, there's a line in the sand. Government over there, Parliament, can do certain things. Everything else we're doing over here. He's kind of the original 10th Amendment guy, the delegated and reserved powers guy, although James Otis was taking the same position a few years earlier against the writs of assistance. But Patrick Henry also gave us the strategy of how to deal with it. First of all, there is that line in the sand, and he's specifically talking about the taxes. He said, as soon as they go beyond that limit, you are not bound to yield obedience to acts outside of those limits. And I covered that in some detail in an episode, Patrick Henry versus the Stamp Act, which will be linked to in the show notes. And I promised a little Alexander Hamilton. If Madison is telling us that everyone admits that the nullification described by Jefferson is a natural right against insupportable oppression, even Hamilton took this type of a view. And here in Federalist number 33, he's describing the Supremacy Clause, explaining how Hamilton, of course, is not on our side on almost anything, but he's pointing out that when government goes beyond its limits, those acts are void. But here's the kicker. He said, acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. And in essence, nullification is how unconstitutional acts that are void, usurpations of power, that's how they deserve to be treated. Rejected, resisted, and brought into no legal or practical effect, because even if they keep it on the books, if you can't convince the federal government to remove that law from the books, to turn it over, you have to treat it as if it has no effect anyway. And that's what nullification really gets down to. So that's the first one that I want to point out. It wasn't created out of thin air. This was how everyone understood that you had to keep the government in check. Now, the second one is, well, it's racist. And despite the fact that Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, for example, were all about nullification of attacks on free speech and federal control over migration even, some people, through ignorance or deceit or a combination of the two, want you to believe that nullification is racist and was only used in support of slavery. In essence, that's what we're told. Nullification was the side of the slave owners. This is absolutely absurd if anyone has studied any of the actual history. It was the northern states that were using nullification specifically against the federal Fugitive Slave Acts of both 1793 and 1850. I covered that in some detail in an episode just last week, Monday, Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, one of the worst ever. I also discussed a little bit of the Act of 1793. And in that episode, I also pointed out how leading abolitionists like John Greenleaf Whittier, William Lloyd Garrison, Walt Whitman were in support of nullification against the federal slavery acts. Now, whether you can agree with their approach to the Constitution, their strategy, whatever, or the opposition, doesn't matter what side you take on that. This is not about factions, because I know some people will tell me, oh, well, Garrison was definitely not a constitutionalist, and that's not the point. The point is they were on board with nullification against a slave law, a pro-slavery law. So in and of itself, it's impossible to say that nullification in and of itself as a tool is a racist or pro-slavery institution. And that's not even covering people like Lysander Spooner, who was arguing in favor of direct resistance and jury nullification against those federal acts. But I also covered in that episode how South Carolina in December of 1860, specifically complained in detail about northern nullification of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. They said the northern states, quote, have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. So again, nullification, like any other, like pretty much everything else, is really just a tool. It can be used for good, and tools can be used for bad things. And some people have, in fact, tried but failed to use it in support of things like forced segregation. They weren't on board. They were using it against desegregation. Maybe that's the semantic argument. But you might notice that most of the people who cite the one or two bad instances, and most of the people who cite the one or two bad instances don't even know about a third one. We're going to cover that here at some point. To use nullification in support of something racist or pro-slavery never seem to have an issue with the other side of the spectrum. The fact that centralized power, the federal government, despite all the horrible things that they have done, the murderous things that has been done in the name of centralized power to protect and control basically everyone on earth, it's only the few isolated instances where someone has used a tool in a bad way that nullification is suddenly racist and, well, in support of slavery. And I think that's because for people who tell you this or who ignore the other end of the spectrum, they're doing it intentionally, because what they're really getting at is that they don't like tools that stop centralized power. I'm going to link to that episode and the other stuff that I'm mentioning and all the source documents that I'm going to be mentioning in this episode. Alan Mosley puts together the blog post for that. We publish it around a few hours after the live stream is done here in the morning or afternoon, whenever you happen to be watching or listening, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And as you scroll through each episode, you will find a blog post for every episode that has not only all the different platforms we're on, video and audio, but also a handy show links section, so you can read all the stuff that I'm mentioning in context and learn more on your own time. And while I'm here, I just want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, thank you so much. Hope you've had an awesome weekend, and I hope your Monday's off to a good start as well. There's Kirk and Haji, Lawrence Smith, Alt Reality, King Nobody, Rick, Senator DT, John, and everyone else. I appreciate you guys being here. I'll take a look and see if I can get some comments or questions to respond to a little bit later, either here on the live stream or maybe later in the chat later on today or in the archive comments. I always look through the comments while we're doing some of the post-production stuff, and Alan's organizing the blog, generally a couple of hours right after the live stream is done. Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, those are the best places if you want to interact and send me some comments that I will see as quickly as possible. I don't get to reply to everything, but I do my best. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So we've got two. One, nullification was created out of thin air. This is a total myth. It was not. It is a natural right. It's part of our humanity. Two, it's a racist thing that is only used in support of racism and to support slavery. This is absolute, well, it's an absolute crock. And number three, there's actually only one way to nullify. And I didn't know how the best way to actually describe this one, but basically, a lot of people think nullification goes like this. The feds pass a law or they implement something. Then a state, in response, passes something that says the federal act is unconstitutional and then nullified. And then, supposedly, somehow, the federal act is gone, as if there's some kind of a nullification button that can be pressed on a state. Well, there is no nullification button, and this has never actually happened ever. It has never happened where the Fed said, this is what we're doing. A single state says, no, you can't because it's unconstitutional. This is null and void. And then everybody backed down and it was over. That process has never happened. And it has been tried, but it failed. And even James Madison railed against this, which I covered in another episode. Did James Madison reject nullification? I just want to briefly point you to that one. It also will include, I'm pretty confident, I haven't listened to it in a while, but I'm pretty confident it will include that first statement that I went to with James Madison on the first point, where he talked about it as a natural right and a remedy against insupportable oppression. And I would actually argue today, if you think it can only be used in extreme cases, well, we live under the largest government in the history of the world. If that's not considered insupportable oppression, then nothing is. So nullification should be used all of the time. Now, even Thomas Jefferson did not think that there was a one-size-fits-all, just press a nullification button and just it's all done and over and everybody backs down and we're all in a happy place. Even Jefferson himself, a day after the Kentucky resolutions were signed, November 16th, 1798, so on the 17th, he fires off a letter to James Madison and emphasize that steps forward for nullification. Now, this was a resolution calling for nullification. It didn't say that we are nullifying. It is declaring the opinion of it. Now, what do you do about it? And that's what he's telling James Madison. And of course, Madison authored the Virginia resolutions that passed the following month, Christmas Eve, 1798. But he pointed out, and it's not hard to read into this at all, where Jefferson is emphasizing that you don't know exactly how you're going to stop the federal act from being implemented in your state. It depends on the situation. It could depend on the specific act you're referencing, and it probably is different in each state. And this is how Jefferson put it in that letter to James Madison. He said, "I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain so as to hold to that ground in the future and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent." What a surprise. Jefferson was a strategist and recognized that when two governments or two regions were having a conflict, in essence, it's kind of a test of wills. Roger Sherman, at some point in December of 1787, said all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. And he said, nor could they be enforced against the sense of a majority of the states. So this is clearly obvious, that as long as the government, the central or general government, passes something that they're not supposed to, just because you tell them that you don't like it or you think it's unconstitutional, they're not going to stop on their own. They're going to still try to enforce it. And Sherman thought it would take a majority of the states to put it to an end. And that means the feds are trying to enforce and the states are resisting, refusing to participate, refusing to enforce. And ultimately, it's the people refusing to comply, because if the people still comply with the federal act, there's nothing for the states to nullify whatsoever. And Jefferson, I think, recognizes this as well, because he knows you have to look at events on the ground and then push a little bit more and more and more until you get rid of something. Now, the closest thing that we actually get to a blueprint on how to stop federal acts without relying on the feds to somehow magically do something that they never do, which is limit their own power, the closest we get to that comes from James Madison in Federalist number 46. He advised 4 steps. First one, protests by the people. Second one is non-compliance by the people and non-enforcement by the states, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, outspoken governors, and state what he called legislative devices. And again, he left that very open-ended. What are those legislative devices? That certainly could be different based on the issue. So if the feds are trying to require people to do something, that's going to be a different state legislative device than if the feds are trying to prohibit people from doing something. You just have to look at each situation and then also think what Jefferson had to say, push as far as events will render prudent. Now, that doesn't mean going too soft. I mean, maybe we can think about the art of the deal a little bit, maybe push a little bit harder than what we want to get. So then if you have to back off a little bit, then it sounds more reasonable to your opposition. So I covered Madison's strategy in an article a few years ago. James Madison, 4 steps to stop federal programs, of course. That will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And again, this can play out so many different ways today. It could be non-enforcement, again, legalize what the federal government prohibits. Could there be more direct interposition action? Sometimes we saw that in response to the Fugitive Slave Acts. I'm not sure if anyone's really ready for that type of thing, but again, the strategy plays out differently based on the state, based on the federal issue, based on the events on the ground, and the like. And so the fourth one that I want to cover is that nullification is really just a last resort. We should just, Bolden, all this other stuff is well and good, and I'm on board with it. But man, this is dangerous stuff, and it should only be used as a very last resort. Otherwise, we're going to have absolute chaos here. Now, let's first start out with Thomas Jefferson again in his Kentucky Resolution draft in 1798, and he put it this way: in cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. What does that mean? Pretty straightforward. When the government uses the delegated powers in ways that you don't like it, but they're still within the limits of the Constitution, the change of the people in office, the vote the bums out strategy, is the proper constitutional remedy. But where powers are assumed, Jefferson wrote, which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So for Thomas Jefferson, if he's the guy who created it out of thin air, then, which he wasn't, but if he was, then of course, then this is the only way to approach it. Now, there are different approaches on how to use this. Jefferson was the most aggressive. He thought, well, he was equal to some others. I mean, I guess Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 33 said, soon as they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, this is a usurpation and it deserves to be treated as such. What does that mean? Does that mean comply with it and wait for them to stop doing what they were never supposed to do in the first place? No, that is absolutely absurd. And Jefferson is telling us that, even his archenemy here is right. Where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, which is today constantly 24/7, 365, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, not something to try after everything else has failed, because the fact that they're going beyond the limits of the Constitution tells you that everything else has already failed. If the choosing new people in power, or the lawsuits, or the protests, or showing them the document, have them read the Constitution, if that stuff was working, they wouldn't already be going beyond the limits of the Constitution, and nullification would not be the rightful remedy because there'd be nothing to nullify. So the fact of the matter that they are actually violating the Constitution and usurping power tells us so much already. Now, James Iredell took a very similar approach. He didn't use the exact same language, but he told us this is, again, he's one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court. He was a highly respected legal mind, a Federalist. He was nominated for the Supreme Court by George Washington. And he told us in the North Carolina ratifying convention that the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. It's not an idea to try later on. It's not something that, you wait for the last minute. No, but the only way to deal with usurpation of power, an exercise of power that's not delegated to the government and the Constitution, which is really a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states, is the inherent right or natural right of the people to prevent its exercise, to nullify it into oblivion, again, where it belongs. And that is because the founders and the old revolutionaries understood that precedent was the problem. Once you allow the government to get away with one thing, they're going to get away with another and another and another. John Dickinson had a story about how this happened to the Spanish in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. And the way he described it was the moment that they set the precedent for them to raise money without consent of their parliament, in essence, for a war in an emergency situation. The moment they allowed them to change that system for one emergency, that's the moment they lost their freedom. It wasn't decades later when they actually expanded on that power and used it to attack the freedom. The moment you lose it, if we have to understand the root cause of the problem, was the precedent. Dickinson in 1765 also called compliance with the Stamp Act the detestable precedent. They understood. Jefferson in 1791 said establishing a central bank was a single step beyond the Constitution. Well, I think he thought it was much bigger than that, but he said even if you thought it was a small constitutional violation, a single step beyond the limits drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power. And that's what James Otis Jr. was getting at in 1767, writing as Freeborn American. He said, "It is, my countrymen, of the utmost consequence that we boldly oppose the least infraction of our charter and rights as men. Obsta principiis is a maxim never to be forgot." And that's a Latin phrase which John Adams and other founders had used. It means nip it in the bud. Nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. Obsta principiis. And Otis continued. He said, "If we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late." Again, this nullification, whether you want to call it nullification, you want to call it the Easter Bunny, I don't care what the word is. Some people really can't stand the term and they think it's evil or associated with the bad guys, wrongly or rightly. I don't care what you call it. Resistance, noncompliance, supporting the Constitution, nullification, interposition, anything, everything, as long as it's being done, that's what matters. Because if you really think about it, things are actually the other way around on this point. Nullification isn't the dangerous thing that we have to be scared of and only used as a last result. Not nullifying is what's extremely dangerous and should be avoided at virtually all costs. Because as soon as you establish that detestable precedent, the government people will build on it. They never use the previous administration's power as a ceiling of how far they go. They use it as a floor, and they always build upon it and build upon it and build upon it. And that's why you can look back a few administrations and think that one of these worst people in history, one of these worst presidents in history, now looks like a small government guy compared to what they have today. That's because they always continue to expand their power as long as the people refuse to nullify them, all their unconstitutional acts. And this is the kind of information we work very, very hard to get out to more and more people every single day. Absolutely nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you support the work that we're doing, that really helps a great deal. No pressure to join us. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. But if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat laying around, throw it our way. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a look over on the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions that I can get back to here. Not nullifying it. Yes, somebody already beat me to the punch. Oh, it's Haji. Good to see you, buddy. Not nullifying is the dangerous path because, again, as soon as you allow government to do something they shouldn't be doing, bump stock ban, whatever, and then you wait on the same government to overturn what the government shouldn't have been doing in the first place, the odds of them overturning it is very low. And let's say you get a few here and there. The precedent that you establish, ultimately, what Jefferson was talking about in the Kentucky resolutions, if you establish a precedent that government gets to determine the extent of the powers delegated by the people to the government, the agent gets to determine how much the principal, well, what's the right term there? Basically, if government gets to determine the extent of its own powers, we shouldn't be surprised that government always grows. It doesn't matter which team is in power, and it doesn't matter what kind of checks and balances are there. So as long as the people of the states allow the central or federal government to actually determine if the government is right or wrong in its own actions, we will basically be under a situation of unlimited submission at all times. Chaos can be good, Kirk Morrison, compared to tyranny. And I don't think, to me, I don't even go that far. And I think Kirk was probably responding to the idea that nullification is dangerous and chaotic and absolutely insane and all this stuff. And a lot of people take that position because they're afraid. They prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty. And Jefferson called those people timid men. And I don't think what we have today is anything other than absolute chaos. The idea, and this is actually one of the grievances, it's actually one of the injuries and usurpations is how it's listed in the Declaration of Independence. This idea of arbitrary power is specifically spelled out as one of the reasons they seceded from Great Britain. And that is, arbitrary power is when they just exercise power based on political whim. It doesn't matter what rules they're given, they do what they want. And to me, that is the ultimate level of chaos because you can't have any consistency. You just have to wonder what the dudes in charge are going to do to you or try to do you at any turn. And it can change back and forth. It affects foreign policy, domestic policy, anything and everything. And it's absolute chaos to keep people's heads spinning like they have been. And I'm sure that's what they love doing. But the only way to get a stable situation is to force the government to stay within the limits of the Constitution, whether they want to or not. And the tool, of course, the inherent right of the people to prevent those exercises of powers that they're not delegated, as James Iredell put it, is really the rightful remedy. Well, I'll take a look over in the live chat a little bit later today or tomorrow. I read through basically all of it. I don't get a chance to reply to too much, but comments in the archive, smashing the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts and other podcast platforms, all these things can help trigger the algorithms or tell people that we're doing an awesome job or at least a decent job. I'm always working to improve and get you guys better quality and better information, more interesting stuff. And if you've got suggestions for future episodes, I get a lot of ideas from your feedback, either through the comments or through email at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Don't hesitate to write anytime. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. More important than anything, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.